The air inside the dealership buzzed with the usual hum of business. Engines revving, pens scratching on paperwork, and voices negotiating deals. But for James Carter, today wasn't just another day at Summit Motorsports. Dressed in a worn leather jacket and faded jeans, he stood near the entrance, his fingers tracing the edges of an old motorcycle key in his pocket. No one recognized him. Not as the owner, anyway. He'd spent years building this dealership from the ground up, but lately, whispers of dishonest sales tactics had reached his ears. Inflated prices, deceptive upsells, and employees more focused on commissions than customer service. He needed to see the truth for himself. Just as he approached the counter, ready to pose as a regular customer, a hushed conversation behind him made him stop cold. "Yeah, man. They totally ripped me off last week," a voice muttered. James felt a slow burn rise in his chest. "They act all nice, but trust me, these guys will bleed you dry if you don't know what you're doing," another voice added. His grip tightened on the key. If his own customers were saying this, then something was very, very wrong. James Carter had built Summit Motorsports from nothing. What had started as a small garage in his 20s had grown into one of the most well-known motorcycle dealerships in the state. Every bike on the showroom floor, every customer who walked through the glass doors, he had once known them all personally. But things had changed. At 52, James was no longer the grease-stained mechanic working late into the night with oil on his hands. He was the CEO, the man behind the desk, buried under spreadsheets and meetings. Somewhere along the way, Summit Motorsports had stopped feeling like his dream and started feeling like just another business. He had handed over most of the day-to-day operations to his general manager, Richard, a sharp but profit-driven man who had been with the company for the last decade. Lately, though, James had noticed something unsettling. Loyal customers stopped returning. Online reviews hinted at pushy sales tactics, overpriced add-ons, and cold, impersonal service. He had dismissed it at first. Businesses always had a few unhappy customers. But when an old friend told him he'd walked away from a deal because of how he was treated, James knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. So today, he wasn't coming in as James Carter, owner. Today, he was just another guy looking to buy a bike. The dealership was as sleek as ever, glass walls gleaming under the afternoon sun, the scent of polished metal and fresh rubber filling the air. Rows of motorcycles stood proudly on display. From roaring cruisers to sleek racing models, their chrome details catching the light. Employees in neatly pressed uniforms moved through the showroom, some engaged in high-energy negotiations, others tending to customers with polite smiles. Behind the front counter, a young salesman named Eric, ambitious but often overeager, flipped through a pricing guide. Near the service area, Sophia, one of the few employees James still trusted completely, tightened a bolt on a customer's bike, her sharp eyes scanning for imperfections. And at the heart of it all was Richard, the general manager, standing tall in his tailored suit, effortlessly closing a deal with a customer. His voice carried a polished confidence, his handshake firm. To an outsider, he looked like the perfect leader. But James had an uneasy feeling. He took a slow breath, stepping deeper into the showroom. Today, he would see what Summit Motorsports had become. Not from behind a desk, not through quarterly reports, but as a customer, one who had no power, no influence. And if what he suspected was true, things were about to change. James kept his posture relaxed as he approached the front counter, scanning the showroom floor like any other customer. He had already spotted the bike he wanted, a sleek black cruiser, the kind he used to ride when he first fell in love with motorcycles. Before he could reach it, Eric, the young salesman, intercepted him with a practiced smile. Looking for something in particular today, James shrugged, playing his part, thinking about that cruiser over there. Just looking, though. Eric's smile widened, sensing an opportunity. "Great choice. Let me walk you through it." As Eric launched into his sales pitch, James listened carefully. At first, everything seemed above board. He highlighted the features, the performance, the financing options. But then, things shifted. "You're getting a steal at this price," Eric said, patting the handlebars. "This model's in high demand. We usually charge a couple grand more, but I might be able to work something out for you." James raised an eyebrow. He knew the exact price of this bike. He'd said it himself, and it wasn't on sale. Eric continued, lowering his voice. "Listen, if you're serious, I can get you an extended warranty and a priority service package for a fraction of the normal cost. But only if you decide today." James folded his arms. The extended warranty? That wasn't a deal. It was a forced upsell. And priority service? That was just a fancy way of charging extra for what should have been standard customer care. Before he could call Eric out, voices behind him caught his attention. Two customers stood by a different bike, speaking in hushed tones. A younger man in his 20s gestured toward a contract, while his friend frowned. "They told me this was the best deal I could get," the young man muttered. "But I looked at the MSRP before we came in. This is way over." His friend shook his head. "They added fees I've never even heard of. You sure you want to do this?" James felt his pulse quicken. Before the young man could respond, Richard, the general manager, strode toward them with an easy confidence. "Gentlemen, any concerns? I'd be happy to clear them up." The young man hesitated. "It's just this price seems higher than what I saw online." Richard's expression didn't waver. I see. What you're looking at is the base MSRP. That doesn't include dealership fees, assembly, and our premium care package. Trust me, you won't find a better deal anywhere else." James clenched his jaw. He had approved none of these so-called fees. The young man still looked unsure, but Richard clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Tell you what, I'll knock off $100, but this price is only good right now." The pressure, the manipulation. James had heard enough. His business, his legacy, was being used to exploit customers, and that was something he could not ignore. James felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach as he watched Richard pressure the young man into signing the contract. The excitement in the customer's eyes had dulled into something hesitant, uncertain. Yet he still picked up the pen. James had seen enough. He turned back to Eric, who was still smiling, waiting for his answer. "I think I need a minute," James said, keeping his tone even. Eric nodded, unfazed. "Of course. Just don't wait too long. This deal won't last." James walked away, weaving through the rows of motorcycles, his mind racing. How had this happened? He'd built Summit Motorsports with honesty and passion. He had personally hired Richard years ago, trusting him to uphold those same values. Yet somewhere along the way, things had changed. His gut burned with frustration, not just at Richard but at himself. Had he been too distant, too trusting? James knew there was only one way to find out: digging deeper. Instead of leaving, James headed toward the service area, where Sophia was working on a sport bike. The scent of motor oil and metal filled the air, grounding him. "Sophia?" he greeted, leaning against the tool chest. She glanced up, wiping grease from her hands. "James, sorry, sir." She hesitated. "You're not exactly dressed like yourself today." He gave her a knowing smile. "That's the idea." She raised an eyebrow but said nothing, waiting for him to continue. "You've been here a long time," he said. "Long enough to notice if things aren't the way they used to be." Sophia sighed, tightening a bolt. "You're asking if I think Richard is running things the right way." James nodded. She hesitated, then set down her wrench. "Look, I love this place. I always have. But things, they aren't the same. Ever since you took a step back, the focus has been different. It's not about bikes anymore. It's about squeezing every dollar out of customers." James felt his jaw tighten. "And you've seen this firsthand?" She scoffed. "All the time. People come in expecting one price and leave paying way more. Eric, he's young, but he's just doing what he's taught. And Richard," she shook her head, "he's a shark. If he can sell someone a bike at twice the price, he will." and he'll smile doing it. James exhaled slowly. He had hoped he was wrong, that maybe the whispers, the reviews, the bad feeling in his gut were all misunderstandings. But now he knew. A silent observation. Instead of confronting Richard immediately, James decided to observe more. He spent the next few hours watching. A young couple excitedly picked out their first bike, only for Eric to saddle them with an inflated price and a mountain of unnecessary add-ons. An older man, clearly experienced with motorcycles, tried to negotiate a fair deal, only for Richard himself to step in and manipulate the conversation, making the customer feel like walking away would be a mistake. Each interaction left James feeling a mix of anger and disappointment. This wasn't just bad business. This was wrong. He needed to act. But if he wanted to fix Summit Motorsports, he had to be smart about it. The first step, confronting Eric. James caught up with Eric as the young salesman stepped outside for a break. The setting sun cast long shadows over the parking lot, the cool evening air offering a stark contrast to the tension James felt. "Eric," he said, his voice steady. Eric turned, surprised. "Oh, hey, back to look at the bike." James shook his head. "No, I want to ask you something." Eric shifted uneasily. Sure. What's up?" James studied him. "Do you believe in what you're selling?" Eric frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean, do you feel good about how you're selling these bikes? About the deals you're offering?" Eric hesitated. "I mean, it's just how things are done. Richard says it's the best way to make a living in this business." James nodded slowly. "And what do you think?" Eric swallowed, glancing around as if checking if anyone was listening. "Honestly?" He sighed. "I don't like it, but I have quotas to meet. If I don't, I lose my commission. And Richard, well, you know how he is." James put a hand on his shoulder. You don't have to sell like this to be successful. There's a better way." Eric looked at him, curious. "And what way is that?" James gave a small, knowing smile. "Stick around and you'll see." The breaking point. James knew he had to act fast. The longer this went on, the more damage was being done. To customers, to employees like Eric and Sophia, and to the very reputation of the business he had spent his life building. The next morning, he walked into Summit Motorsports, but this time as himself. Dressed in a crisp button-up and his old leather jacket, he strode onto the showroom floor with the confidence of a man who owned the place. Employees glanced his way, some straightening up nervously. Eric's eyes widened in recognition. Sophia smirked knowingly from the service bay. And then there was Richard, who, at first, looked surprised. But it quickly faded into the usual, polished smile. "James," Richard greeted smoothly. "What brings you by today?" James met his gaze evenly. "We need to talk." A flicker of something crossed Richard's face, but he nodded. "Of course." "My office." James shook his head. "No, right here." Richard's jaw tensed, but he didn't argue. James turned to the employees and customers in the room. "I started Summit Motorsports with one goal, to share my love of motorcycles with people who shared that passion, to give them honest service and fair prices. But somewhere along the way, we lost that." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Employees exchanged nervous glances. Customers paused, listening. "I've been here undercover," James continued, "watching how my customers are treated. And what I saw, it's not the business I built." Richard's smile faltered. "James, let's not." "We are." James cut him off. "Because this ends today." Richard clenched his jaw, his carefully constructed mask slipping. "James, business isn't what it used to be. We have to adapt. If you want to keep the doors open, you have to make money." James shook his head. "Not like this. Never like this." Silence stretched between them. Richard exhaled sharply. "So what? You're firing me?" James met his gaze with unwavering certainty. "Yes." A stunned silence filled the showroom. Richard scoffed, then let out a bitter laugh. "Good luck running this place without me." James didn't flinch. "I don't need luck. I just need honesty." Richard gave him one last glare before storming out. James turned to the employees. "Things are changing. If you're here to sell with integrity, you have a place in this company. If not, there's the door." Eric, after a moment of hesitation, stepped forward. "I'm in." Sophia crossed her arms. "Took you long enough, boss." A slow smile spread across James's face. The dealership wasn't perfect. It would take time to rebuild. But today was the first step, and he would make sure Summit Motorsports became the business he had always meant for it to be. The silence in the showroom was deafening. Employees stood frozen in place. Customers who had overheard James's speech shifted uncomfortably. Their curiosity piqued. Richard, his face a mix of anger and disbelief, still hadn't moved. His carefully polished facade had cracked, but something in his eyes told James he wasn't going to walk away without a fight. Richard scoffed, shaking his head. "You can't be serious." James met his gaze, unwavering. "I am." Richard let out a short, humorless laugh. "You have no idea what you're doing, James. I built the sales team. I made this dealership profitable. You think you can just waltz in here after years of sitting behind a desk and take control again?" James's fingers curled into fists, but he forced himself to stay calm. This business was built on passion, not profit. It was built on trust, not manipulation. And you've turned it into something I don't even recognize. Richard crossed his arms, his confidence returning. "Passion doesn't pay the bills. We're in sales, James. People expect to be pushed. That's how the game works." James took a slow breath, steadying himself. He knew this was the moment, the test of everything he stood for. He could either let Richard convince him that this was just the way things were, that morality had no place in business, or he could stand by his values, no matter the cost. He turned, addressing not just Richard but everyone in the dealership. "I know some of you have felt the change in this place. Maybe you thought it was just business. Maybe you felt like you didn't have a choice. But I built this dealership to be different. And starting today, we will be different." A murmur spread through the room. Employees exchanged glances, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. James turned back to Richard. "You're fired." Richard's jaw tightened. "You don't have the guts." James didn't flinch. "I do. And if you have any respect left for this business, for the people who work here, you'll leave without making this harder than it has to be." Richard stared at him, his eyes narrowing. Then, with a sharp exhale, he smirked. "Your funeral, James." He grabbed his briefcase and turned on his heel, storming out of the dealership. The glass doors swung shut behind him with a finality that sent a ripple through the crowd. A heavy silence followed. James exhaled, the weight on his shoulders both lifting and pressing down at the same time. He had done what was right, but now came the hardest part. He turned to the employees. "This isn't going to be easy," he admitted. "We're going to have to rebuild trust with our customers and with each other. Some of you might not like the changes I'm about to make. And if you don't believe in selling honestly, I won't stop you from leaving." A long pause. Then, to James's surprise, Eric stepped forward. "I want to stay," he said, his voice stronger than before. "I got into this job because I love bikes, not because I wanted to trick people." Sophia smirked, wiping grease from her hands. "I was never leaving." A few others nodded, some hesitant, but willing to give James a chance. James felt something shift. Hope. He had nearly lost Summit Motorsports, but in this moment, he realized something important. He wasn't just saving a business. He was saving the soul of what he had built. The next morning, Summit Motorsports felt different. The air was lighter, though the tension of change still lingered. James arrived early, stepping into the quiet showroom before the day's rush. The rows of motorcycles gleamed under the overhead lights, just as they always had. But today, they felt like his again. The weight that had been pressing on his chest for months, maybe years, was gone. He had taken back control, not just of his business, but of its purpose. Now came the hard part, rebuilding, turning over a new leaf. By mid-morning, James gathered his staff in the showroom for a meeting. Some still looked unsure, others curious. Eric and Sophia stood at the front, their confidence in him giving him the strength to push forward. James took a deep breath. Yesterday, I made a decision to take back this dealership. But changing one person doesn't fix everything. We need to change how we do things, from the ground up. He let that sink in before continuing. I'm getting rid of the dishonest sales tactics. No more unnecessary fees. No more pressure tricks. We're going back to being a dealership people trust. A murmur spread through the group. Some nodded in approval, while others shifted uncomfortably. One of the senior salesmen, Greg, crossed his arms. And what about our commissions? You take away the fees, we lose money. James met his gaze. No, you don't. You just earn it honestly. Greg scoffed. That's easy to say, but people don't always buy just because you're nice to them. Richard made sure we closed. James didn't back down. And how many of those customers came back? How many referred their friends? How many walked away feeling cheated and left bad reviews? Greg fell silent. James continued, short-term profits mean nothing if people don't trust us. I'd rather have 100 happy customers who return than 1,000 one-time sales made with manipulation. Sophia stepped forward, wiping her hands on a rag. You know, I see it all the time in the service department. The customers who trust us, they stay with us. And the ones who feel like they got tricked, they never come back. James nodded. We're not just selling bikes. We're building relationships. That's what Summit Motorsports used to stand for, and it's what we're standing for again. Silence hung in the air. Then Eric spoke up. I want to be part of that. Slowly, other employees began to nod. Greg sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Guess I'm in too. Might take some getting used to, but I started this job because I love bikes, not because I wanted to be a shark. James smiled. Then let's make this place something we can all be proud of. Rebuilding trust. The changes weren't easy. Some employees left, unable to adapt to the new way of selling. James didn't stop them. He only wanted people who believed in the new vision. They revamped their pricing structure, stripping away unnecessary fees and misleading markups. They trained the sales team on ethical sales techniques, focusing on genuine customer needs rather than high-pressure tactics. The first few weeks were tough. Numbers dipped slightly as they adjusted, but James remained firm. He reassured his team that trust took time to rebuild. Then, something remarkable happened. Customers started noticing. A man who had walked out on Richard weeks ago returned, surprised to find the new pricing policy in effect. No hidden fees? He asked, skeptical. Eric, standing proudly behind the counter, shook his head. No tricks, just a fair deal. The man smiled. Now that's how business should be done. Word spread. The dealership's reputation started to shift. Old customers who had left came back, excited to see the changes. Online reviews reflected the transformation. I came in expecting the usual dealership runaround, but I was blown away. No pressure, just honest people who love bikes. This is how it should be. Finally, a dealership that actually cares about its customers. I'll be back. James read each review with pride, knowing they were on the right path. A personal transformation. Late one evening after closing, James stood outside the dealership, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Sophia walked up beside him, arms crossed. You really did it, she said. He exhaled. We did it, and we're just getting started. She smirked. You're not thinking about going back behind a desk again, are you? James chuckled. Not a chance. For the first time in years, he felt alive. He had been so caught up in the business of running a business that he had almost lost sight of why he had started in the first place. He belonged here, on the showroom floor with the people, with the bikes, with his legacy. As he glanced at the dealership, now filled with people he trusted, he knew he had passed the greatest test of his career. He had nearly lost Summit Motorsports to greed and dishonesty, but he had fought to bring it back. And in the process, he had rediscovered himself. The takeaway: James's journey wasn't just about saving a business. It was about reclaiming integrity in a world that often prioritized profit over people. His story proved that success built on deception was never truly success. That doing the right thing wasn't always the easiest path, but it was always worth it. And most importantly, that real leadership wasn't about power. It was about standing up for what was right, even when it was hard. As he locked up for the night, he felt something he hadn't in a long time: peace. 6 months later, Summit Motorsports was thriving. The transformation had been challenging, but the results spoke for themselves. Customers now walked into the dealership expecting honesty, and they got it. Sales were steady, but more importantly, trust was at an all-time high. People weren't just buying motorcycles. They were becoming part of a community. James stood outside the dealership one morning, coffee in hand, watching the lot fill up. A weekend ride event was about to start, something Summit Motorsports hadn't hosted in years. Riders gathered, chatting excitedly, their bikes lined up in perfect formation. Eric approached, now more confident than ever in his role. "You see the turnout? I think we're finally getting it right." James smiled. "We are." Sophia walked by, playfully nudging James. "Bet you never thought going undercover would change everything, huh?" James chuckled. "Not in a million years." As he watched the riders roll out, engines roaring in unison, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. He had nearly lost everything to greed and shortcuts. But by choosing integrity, he had built something real, something that would last. Because at the end of the day, success wasn't about selling the most bikes. It was about earning trust and never losing sight of why you started in the first place.